Yeah, I'm very happy to introduce my colleague, Joan Casas, who belongs to our research group. So he's, presenting, one of our research lines. So I hope that you all enjoy this presentation. Of course, I am also collaborating with him in this research, but he's a real expert. So he's in the best position to explain this. So yeah, Joan, please introduce yourself a bit and then the title of your presentation, and you can start when you are ready. Thank you.
Thanks for the introduction, Santi. I'm going to share my screen, see if it works. It should.
Yes, seen this button in the panel now. Yeah.
Okay, so hopefully I can make it full screen and you'll still see it.
Now it's working. Yes, perfect.
Okay, so well, thanks everyone for attending. As Santi said, we're working together in the SmartLearn research group in Universitat Oberta de Catalunya. And today I'm going to present one of the research lines that we're working on, which has to do with whether and how we can enhance the teaching of ethical skills through the use of interactive narrative approaches. So I'm going to try and be brief, as brief as I can, or at least to fit my presentation in the scheduled time. And first, I'm going to kind of provide some motivations and introduction regarding ethics as a skill. What is it, and why we would be interested into integrating this into the teaching of ethical skills in basically higher education. Then I'm going to move to how the design of this interactive experience meant to support the teaching of these ethical skills has been conducted, and what are the main pillars of this design and the main design decisions behind it. Then I'm going to open the Pandora box of how we are about to conduct an evaluation on that, which we haven't done yet, but we're fiddling on what would be a good method to do so, because, well, as you'll see, there are some tricky things to measure in here. And then I'm just going to conclude with some final remarks and some future work. So first of all, some intro and motivations. Currently, challenges that we face nowadays as society and future challenges do require some sort of really versatile skills, if you want, into identifying, understanding, and accounting for the ethical dimensions of new decisions. Think just about like decisions related to AI, automatic process, or decisions that are happening on a worldwide scale, and that we may need to foresee in order to prevent some, say, undesirable things to happen. Now, ethics is already an important part in the formation of professionals, and it can be found in practically every syllabus of a high-level degree course. But it is often taught from the outside, so to speak. So the way to teach ethics often kind of collapses into compliance, and it's about the rules that have to be followed legally to comply with a series of requirements, say, for instance, privacy and technology and things that do have an ethical dimension, but which are still framed from a legal point of view. And this kind of teaching misses the development of an ethical sensitivity. So beyond understanding the rules, are we actually furnishing those professionals with the skills to identify how their actions can affect the world and how they could affect the world in a better way, so to speak? So we want to move the question on how could ethics be taught, say, from the inside, from the perspective of the future professional or current professional. Now, if we were to dig deeper into ethical theories, that would take us way longer than we have. So I'm just going to be super brief in here. But basically, ethical theories like utilitarianism or deontology, or basically theories based on rules, tend to externalize moral reasoning and keep the subject apart from moral reasoning. So say the agent or the actor has no relevance whatsoever. It's a matter of rules, it's a matter of objective facts. And all this is good and all this is necessary, but the subject gets progressively detached from the scenario. And suddenly the subject progressively loses the ability to understand the nuances of an ethical scenario. So the problem is, what happens when we are faced with an ethically relevant scenario that did not exist beforehand and which is not accounted by the rules? How can the subject who has been, say, pushed out of ethical reasoning can now make sense of this new situation? As we claim in this research, we believe that in order to tackle these current and future challenges, we require professionals, or we would want professionals to be furnished with these skills and versatility in ethical awareness, sensitivity, and reasoning capabilities to be able to foresee and address genuinely new ethically relevant questions. Now, in sum, the subject would need to regain their ethical autonomy. I'll talk about ethical autonomy to refer to this mix of the skills to identify, understand, and reason about new ethically relevant scenarios. So in order to do so, the subject, the agent, has to be brought back into the equation. We get inspiration from theories like virtue ethics, for instance, that provide some direction, so has some virtues or some principles, if you want, or some values that kind of point towards things that are usually good to act towards, but which are not normative prescriptions, because, well, every scenario has their own nuances and every context has their own particularities. So even if those principles are often, say, desirable to follow, the subject has to make an evaluation, has to understand the details of the scenario, and cannot act blindly just by following the rules. And so these kind of theories of ethics are unavoidably linked with the notions of practice and practical wisdom, which are basically talking about experience. You need to understand, you need to experience these sort of situations in order to understand how to act, in order to be aware of what your effects will be and who and what they will affect. Now, in order to teach and learn ethics as a skill, we want to bring this practical wisdom and this subjective involvement back into the learning, so to say. But this cannot be captured via these descriptive and normative approaches, precisely because these approaches do take the person outside of it. It's not about how you perceive the situation, it's about what norm matches with the situation. So using example cases can, of course, take these ethical scenarios closer to our understanding, but still, when we use examples, we're still kind of backseat drivers. We see what happens, we understand that this is so-and-so, and we understand that this is good or desirable, this might not be, but we, say, as students who witness those cases, have no autonomy, we have no agentivity to decide, and so we bear no responsibility whatsoever on what happens. We need, or we want, say, or we desire to integrate this subjective experience as a part of developing these ethical skills, this way of relearning, say, how to reason, how to understand the ethical dimension of our decisions. If we were to focus on fiction, obviously we cannot just practice ethics on a real life context, right? Well, we can also do that, but something we cannot do is just because it's unethical, right? To learn ethics by doing things that might or might not be ethical. So we look at fictions as a way in which we could get exposed to ethically relevant situations and have some sort of a safe space so that we can learn. And if we look particularly into interactive fiction, like Choose Your Own Adventure books and these sort of works, we can see that the reader or the player or the participant has a degree of agentivity that non-interactive media like movies or, say, traditional books do not offer. And if we dig a bit deeper, and focus on digital games, we see that these games recognize the appearance of moral emotions, which are basically guilt and pride, that are unavoidably linked to responsibility. So it's the fact that the player feels responsible for the choices that allows for these emotions to appear. And these emotions wouldn't appear if the player were just a spectator. So we need to integrate this choice, this interactivity, in order to kind of build this subjective experience of the ethical scenario. In game studies, say, these emotions have, at the very least, two necessary, although not sufficient, but necessary features, which are attachments. So these, say, fictional settings need to get the player attached to the characters or to the fiction in order for the player to care about what happens. And they have to have some meaningful choices, or at the very least choices that are perceived as meaningful. Because if the player has no choice, then why should the player feel responsible about it? And then there's some other techniques that we're also interested about, which kind of allow the player to be, say, pulled into the fiction and require the player to genuinely reflect on certain principles or certain ideas that happen within the game. And this is achieved by, say, avoiding an external representation, like a measurement, like a progress bar or numbers or something like that to, say, to represent how ethically the player is acting. Instead of that, some games use no measurement at all, and the player has to make out how they are acting just by seeing how the world reacts to how they act, and so to understand what their actions do to the world and the players living in them, living quote unquote. So the question is, can an interactive narrative be used as a complementary learning tool to teach ethics as a skill? And we explore this by designing a prototype of an interactive narrative. So the three pillars of this triangle, if you want, are attachments and meaningful choices, which I've already talked about, and the creation of these spaces for reflection. Because as we'll see in the next slide, the aim, sorry, it was 2 slides afterwards. The aim of this prototype is not to teach the participants about particular ethical rules or to have them learn about particular rules and norms, but rather to try and expose them to the kind of reasoning that would help them regain this, say, practice or practical wisdom, or incorporate this ethical thinking on their decisions. So because of this, we want to create these spaces for reflection. We would like the players or the participants to have the chance to think about, okay, what have I decided, or what am I going to decide next time, and how could this affect the fictional world or the players in it, and what reactions could I get, and would I like this? Would I not? Would it be good? Would it be acceptable? Blah, blah, blah. And the context is set around information technologies scenarios, because our plan is to test it in IT studies, like in computer science studies. So we kind of match the content of the prototype to the appropriate setting. Now, I'm just going to go briefly around these 3 pillars to discuss the main design decisions that we've taken. In terms of attachments, the narrative, which we're keeping into, say, doable bounds or doable boundaries, has 4 characters aside from the player character. Some of these characters do have an approval system with them, so the way they relate to the player character evolve during the story, depending on how you act and the decisions that you make. The main reasons behind this decision are 2. So first, we wanted to create relationships that can get deeper as the story gets into, and so that different playthroughs may result in the characters relating differently to the player character. And we also wanted to introduce attention regarding characters that approve or disapprove choices. So as in the real world, most of the times when we make a choice that can affect someone else, we might get a reaction, and that someone else might be happy or unhappy about it. So we wanted to capture this dimension as well in our prototype. And aside from that, we wanted to minimize the use of the impersonal narrator's voice. So most of the things that happen within the narrative are kind of told to the player through the voices of these characters. Why that? First, we wanted to kind of dig even deeper into these attachments and make the characters more relatable to the player. And we wanted to avoid the sensation that because something is said from the narrator's voice, it is true or it's objective. Objectivity is, regrettably, something that it's not really abundant in ethically relevant scenarios. So we wanted to avoid the fact that because something is said, then we can suppose it's true. All the things that the player kind of receive on, say, advice or worries or whatever, are from the perspective of a character, who might be right or might be wrong or might be biased or might have some beliefs about the way things will evolve, but there's no guarantee about it. So we wanted to avoid this sensation of I'm being told something that is true. Well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, who knows? The player will see when he or she makes the choice, right? So besides attachments, in terms of meaningful choices, although branching narratives is what comes at mind, kind of pulling a branching narrative that just branches a couple branches for each choices and has 10 choices leaves us with 2 2 to 10 decisions, which is really overwhelming. So like a truly branching narrative that follows everything is, well, it's really a lot of work, and which we cannot assume, and which is really hard to keep consistent throughout if there are to be many choices and many variations. So we use a combination of branches and gates, which is basically different sessions do allow branching out. They all converge to the same node at the end, but we use walled variables, which are called in these branching narratives techniques, which capture certain values on some of the decisions that have been taken and which affect further states of the wall, which might not be directly related to the previous state, but because a decision has been made, then the variable remembers that, so to speak, and so the game adapts, or the narrative adapts to that decision. So this allowed us to keep the scope of the narrative within margins while still offering this variety of choices and the effect of affecting long-term stages of the game. Furthermore, in regarding choices still, we wanted to avoid optimal choices because the game, the narrative prototype, as I said, it's not about learning how to make the right choice, because there's seldom the case a purely right choice in ethical matters, or it's seldom the case that we know about a purely right choice before we take it. So, and because the scope or the aim is to get the players more used to reflect about the ethical dimension of their choices, we intentionally avoided optimal choices. So we mix a tracking of ethical principles, which are in part taken from the IEEE Code of Conduct. We include some economic resources that the player may want to keep into line, because it's actually what keeps the player's work afloat, right? And we've got some approval ratings as well, as we have said, on the characters. And it's actually seldom the case that the player can make one choice that satisfies one of them without, say, messing up with the others. So we're aiming to create what Sicard in game studies call them wicked problems. There's basically no right answer whatsoever. They might be a less bad answer, but never a right one. And as I said, the point is to understand and reflect on the different dimensions and effects that each choice can have, regardless of whether there's a purely good choice or not, which there isn't, by the way. Now, in terms of spaces for reflection, we also intentionally avoid showing any sort of external measures. So these variables are being kept track of, but the player does not explicitly see +1 in this principle or -1 in resources, blah, blah, blah. It's just through the way the characters expose the situation of the game that the player gets to know whether their actions have been aligned with a certain principle or not, or whether resources have been compromised, or whether approval ratings may have changed. So in this sense, the player has to look into the fiction in order to understand and anticipate the outcomes of those choices. And furthermore, because we want the players to be able to reflect, we have to give them some time to reflect, right? Because if the participants were to just binge go through the whole narrative, then reflection might happen afterwards, like, oh, I could have done, but yeah, now it's too late. So we've intentionally cut the narrative into different sessions that are separated by a certain time span, say 1 day, maybe 3 days, depending on whether this prototype is used in a different course as a complementary material, and so it has to align somehow with what is being treated in the course. But yeah, we do provide this space for reflection in the middle, say. How do we actually program this? So the thing is alive. It's not kind of publicly available, but it's up and running. The narrative part is written using Twine, which is an environment specifically designed to buy this kind of interactive narratives. And you can see a little bit of code, which is basically text with some keywords and some commands, and like the whole structure of one of the sessions of the narrative. And each one of these squares is like a block of text, like a screen, basically, that the player will see with choices and variables and whatnot. And the plan is to integrate this narrative into a virtual campus through a web browser. So this language Twine, or this environment Twine, allows to export the narrative directly as an HTML file, which can be edited to incorporate, say, PHP, sync it with a database, so to store the decisions of the players and whatnot. And so this makes it particularly ideal to be integrated in some sort of virtual campus in the web browser itself. Okay, so that being said, this is the design, or these are some of the main design decisions behind it. The prototype is somewhat alive. We still have to run tests, as you'll see in the future work, but we're already asking ourselves, how are we going to evaluate this once we run the tests? Because, well, the goal of the narrative is not to teach about ethical norms, nor is it to teach about how to act in specific ways. It's not about to measure whether the player has taken the right choice, because there is no right choice. It's about developing ethical thinking and the habit of thinking about the ethical dimension of their actions and consequences. So the evaluation is not about gaining some skills, but it's about a comparative change in the learner's predisposition or skill, say, to identify, reflect about, and reason about ethically relevant matters in basically each and every decision that they can make within the narrative and ideally outside of it. Now, the question is then, how can we evaluate this space for action rather than an action itself? Because we're not evaluating the act that the player takes, but rather about the potentiality that comes before having engaged in this narrative. So we're trying to somewhat measuring the unmeasurable. We're measuring the potentiality or this space that will allow the player to action afterwards. So possible ways of evaluating could be an A/B test, comparing users who used this complementary tool while following a module, and comparing this with users who did not, and maybe see whether the ones who use the complementary tool are more prone after that to be aware of the ethical dimension that their decisions might have. And this can also be complemented with some, say, interviews, questionnaires, or other methods before and after, and see if there's like a comparative change in terms of before that student would, say, code like a coding assignment without thinking about the ethical dimension that could be or that could exist beyond data processing. But after using this tool, then the student might say, oh, okay, wait, could there be some ethical effect, something that I have to think about, blah, blah, blah. So ideally, this would be the first, well, the two of the ways that we will explore how we can actually evaluate the prototype. So now for some final remarks on future work. So as we argued at the beginning, we believe that professionals need to integrate ethical reasoning, not just like as a checklist as part of a design or as part of their work, but as an additional layer that should be active in each and every step, because every decision might actually matter in this regard. We do believe as well that relying on purely externally or only relying on externally defined systems of norms cannot guarantee that new scenarios will be identified correctly and that they will be addressed as we would like to. And this might be particularly important in the field of IT as new tools appear and the interactions between new technological tools create new dynamics that somehow they create new effects that were not taken into account by the design of neither one or the other tool, because they emerge from the relationship of both tools. So these things can happen. And because of these ethical skills are needed to identify these new scenarios and address them as we would like to. We believe that these interactive experiences can provide a safe space for exploration because no one gets harmed, say. And if we could pull into this combination of attachment, meaningful choices, and spaces for reflection, then this space safe for exploration can actually provide the subjective experience that could ideally get the players to reflect and integrate these ethical reasoning skills in the future. In terms of future work, first, we would like to test the prototype on a group of teachers to see, particularly if the teachers are teaching something where ethics appear, to see whether they have some suggestions, some way to make improvements, maybe on the way these wicked problems are presented or the topics that are touched in the narrative. Then we would like to test the prototype on a group of students and evaluate whether it's effective and whether we manage to convey this subjective experience and reasoning. And because the prototype is now purely text-based with some images, we know that, well, we live in the modern times, right? We're not in the times of the books anymore. And so we would really like to introduce some audio, some video, some more interactive elements to the prototype to make it more appealing and also easier to relate to, because if you have maybe some images, some sort of characters, some sort of voices, it might be easier to strengthen these attachments and so to strengthen the whole experience as it is. And that's everything. So if you've got any questions or any discussion or comment, I'd be more than happy to answer.
Okay, Joan, thank you very much for the very instructive presentation. So you have a couple of minutes for questions and discussion. Well, in the meantime, we wait for questions in the panel. Actually, I would like to maybe to pick one of the comments that we received from our paper, from the reviewers, if you remember, that they commented or they claimed maybe about more details of the evaluation, which actually is an in progress research. So now we are not yet in the evaluation stage, but maybe we could share some, not some details, but some purposes of what we plan to do or what we plan to show or to demonstrate, to validate with this evaluation. So maybe you could be more specific about what could be the specific research question here that we plan to verify, and how or what the method could be to have this validation or this or to verify this research question. And I would like also to link this to, since this research is quite general in terms of to provide the students with more ethical thinking, ethical behavior, which is quite general. I would like also to link this to, you know, that we are working on this specific topic of ethical in education, and specifically how the people use educational technology in an ethical way. In that specific context, how we could demonstrate that people using or people that are educated following this approach can somehow minimize the risks of using educational technology in a non-ethical way, you know. I don't know, if you can elaborate a bit about that. I'm sorry.
That's all right. So I'll try to address both questions somewhat quickly because of the time. In terms of the evaluation, so as I kind of briefly mentioned in the slides, the challenge is that although the students will be using this prototype online and will be, say, making decisions and answering the questions there, because the prototype is not about evaluating their choices, this is quite tricky, because it's not about whether they've taken the right or the wrong decision, although they will be provided with like a summary of what their decisions have been. But the evaluation should happen, say, in the student themselves, in terms of seeing whether they have become more aware of the relevance of the ethical layer of every dimension, meaning that every choice that they make in their work, say, as a computer scientist, can have an effect even when it seems it doesn't. Say, even in the stage of data gathering, in which, well, I just gather the data, I just send it through the machine learning algorithm or whatever, and I don't worry about it because it's data. Well, we now know that data is not just data, it can be more than that, it can have some integrated bias